welcome again to everybody, as Sanjay said, to the second day of this wonderful festival. I am here, as he said, my name is Venkatesh Murthy. I am here not only as a neuroscientist with an interest in artificial intelligence, and therefore one of the main topics of this festival, but also to represent the Lakshmi Mittal Institute at Harvard, as Sanjay just said. And the Mittal Institute, actually, the way in which I have been involved in is to foster exchange between scholars, scientific scholars, in India and in the Boston area. It started with Harvard University, my home, but in the kind of the greater Boston area. I mean, the goal was essentially simply the basic idea that sort of scientific and scholarly exchange between the two regions, ideally in a symmetric way, would help catalyze both sides. So exchanging ideas and just having free flow of information, and particularly for young scientists. So a couple of examples of the programs we have done so far include brief, unfortunately brief, it would be nice to be longer, postdoctoral fellowships in the Boston area for fresh PhD students in India. I mean, this program, if it's scaled up to much larger numbers, would be actually quite fantastic, giving opportunities for fresh science doctorates to come and do some research and training in the US, and then potentially come back to contribute to India. And the other side of this exchange program is for faculty at Harvard and MIT and Boston University and institutions in the Boston area to come and conduct workshops for young scientists in India, ideally on topics that are at the cutting edge and perhaps combining multiple disciplines. And I think it's fair to say that neuroscience is one discipline which is really at kind of the combination of many different sort of specialty fields, if you will. So those exchange programs are going. They're quite successful, well supported by now by even the Department of Biotechnology here. But I think there's enormous room to improve this, and we would welcome ideas and help in any way for sort of expanding these exchange programs. So I want to actually, before I sort of step down, I want to actually say a few words, kind of a bit more of a personal take on science and like why do we even do things like the Science Festival and so on. And I think perhaps I want to start with saying the obvious fact that science is essentially a way of looking at the world where you take observations and construct models of what it means, what the observations mean. So if you want to understand planetary motions, people started with just having all the observations, all this huge number of observations, and what does it actually mean? And then, of course, people, scientists hundreds of years ago came up with simple explanations of, if you make this kind of a model of the world, that explains all of these motions. So essentially, science is a way of understanding the world, and it's always going to be an approximation of the reality, but you keep improving the approximation. So science is really a way of thinking, a way of understanding the world. And I repeat this because many of us, I include myself, growing up in India as an engineer, that we often conflate science with just technology and applied science. It's all in a continuum. I'm not saying it's denied, but when somebody says science, people think, okay, are you making cell phones? Like, are you building something? Are you curing a disease? Are you building a device to do something? Those are all fantastic. It's easy to appreciate the importance of applied science and engineering and technology, because look around. Everything here, man-made, is probably due to technology, right? I mean, advancing and building things and applying it, often to the betterment of our lives, but not always, but often to make our lives easier. But what about this idea of basic science? I mean, that seems a bit of a luxury, right? I mean, like, why would, that seems like, if you have all the time, if you are well off, then you go and do basic science, right, and not care about society. And I think that's false. I think science perhaps should be seen as a way of just any day you can just think about how something works. How does the world work? How does your body work? How does anything work? And then making observations and sort of coming up with explanations for that genuinely is science. So I think science can be done by everybody. I think if you can imagine a society where all citizens are in some sense interested in doing science. And I want to give you a little bit of a metaphor with huge number of you in the audience, I suspect, are interested in playing music, whether in a, you're interested in, you never actually got to play an instrument, you just sing, or you just pick up instruments, you learn something. And I suspect most of you are doing this not because you want to make money out of playing music. You don't want to be professional musicians. You do it for whatever reason, right? It brings you joy. Same thing with play. You go out and play, whether it's cricket or badminton or table tennis, whatever. You play. You play. Why is it that you play voluntarily? You play music. You learn, do all these things. Of course, it's because those things are seen as hobbies that bring you joy, right? I mean, you have this thing and you do. So I am wondering now, could we make just thinking about science, could that be a hobby for everybody? So you go, imagine we're able to do what we formerly called science in the playground, in your garden, and not just in the classroom. You don't have to go have expensive equipment, lots of physics and math and whatever to do, and then you do your experiments. What if you could go and say, okay, I'm going to go to the garden, there is a small caterpillar walking around, I'm going to observe, I'm just going to take a video to your iPhone or something, or your Android phone, and you take a video and you want to say, like, how does it move? Can I understand how this small insect is crawling, right? You can spend, maybe it's just 1 hour, you do that repeatedly, and you come up with some ideas. If you know some math, maybe you can put some equations down to do it. So what if we make that somehow really fun? Like, if you just inculcate from a young age that this can be a hobby, it's not a profession, it's not about building a device, it's not about, can we do that? And I don't know the answer. It seems like that's a worthwhile goal to think about. How do we kind of make it? And I think the answer is clear that this can only happen if things are inexpensive, accessible, and you give people time. And I think those are the things perhaps we should think about. I think making science inexpensive, I think, is fundamental for democratizing it, right? I mean, how else can you make, if I can just say, oh, everybody should be thinking about science, but what does that mean? You should be able to kind of go and do it. It's not expensive. You have the luxury of that time, and then you kind of do that. There are efforts that are already underway. I mean, I think some of you probably know about the Atal Tinkering Labs, sort of government-sponsored one. There are also individuals, like I think many of you probably heard of this little fold scope thing that Manu Prakash has popularized. So there are things that one could do, and I encourage all of us, particularly the adults, whether or not you have a lot of money or whether you have something to contribute in terms of education, let's all think about how is it that we can make science not just always about what can you produce. That's going to come. That's market-driven, and that's going to happen anyway, right? But what about just being brutally unapologetic about saying, like, it's also okay to just think about science, and maybe just start with being a hobby. So that's sort of my plea, and I'm going to just stop there and wish you all the best today and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you for coming.